when we're trying to do system change, we need to get people who have got lived experience, who want that change. We need people who've got the power in the system.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
And this isn't about shiny corporate case studies, it's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others.
In this episode, we're sharing our conversation with Jim Sanders, Director of Innovation and Transformation at RNIB, the Royal National Institute of Blind People, the UK's leading sight loss charity. Jim shares how RNIB are embracing AI and technology alongside a forward-thinking approach to user experience to drive innovation for blind and partially sighted people across the UK.
And they're doing some great work. But before we get to Jim, this week is very much a back to school week, Zoe. All of my clients are back and the kids are vacating the houses and going back to school. And I understand your youngest is having her first day at secondary school today. Was she excited?
She was excited and also, in her words, terrified. So I was trying to reassure her that that was a good place to be, being out of her comfort zone. Whether she listened to me or not, I don't know. I guess I'll find out at 4:00 today when she's back.
And we can report on her progress in a couple of weeks' time on the next episode to see how she's doing. Mine had her first day in Year 7 too, yesterday. And I was amazed to find out that she is apparently studying Mandarin. My boys do French and Spanish, but yeah, Mandarin. Anything like that on the agenda in the Amal household?
I think there might be an option like that, but again, I guess I'll find out more once she's back later.
Yeah. Good. And so as we're discussing children going back to school and technology, I wanted to briefly chat about the BBC Panorama programme from this week, which we watched last night, called Can We Live Without Our Phones? And this is linked to an article. So we share both the article and the link to the video on the iPlayer. It's very, very much interlinked, but there's an article on the BBC about the social media algorithms and what they are serving up, particularly to teenage boys. That's covered in the programme. But the biggest part of the programme was that they took away two children's phones from them for a week and set up cameras in the house to see how things changed, how behaviour changed. And I thought this is really interesting. Number one, because we both have teenage children who've grown up very much in the smartphone age. And B, because we often talk on this podcast about technology and our use of technology. And I think the challenging thing here was that the week without phones didn't just change things for the children, it changed things for the parents too. And what I thought was really interesting was there's a subject that we sort of brush up against quite often on this podcast, is how the smartphone has become a very much a sort of a gateway, a lifeline, if you like, not a gateway, a lifeline, and a connection point between kids and their friends, which didn't really exist in our day, because in our day, when we were growing up, our interaction with our friends would be to go and knock on their doors and see if they were available to come out and play, and we'd be playing in the streets, and that has shifted because of child safety and all sorts of other things. But it was really interesting to see just how reliant and just how connected children are through their smartphones and the impact of social media.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'll definitely have to watch that programme. Similar issues in this house as well. So I think that's going to be definitely one I need to watch as a parent. And it is interesting, isn't it, how much it's phones are sort of woven into our social lives, but also our workplace culture as well. Was there any kind of read across there, do you think, around that dependency on devices?
There was a bit of a sort of I think a realization that the kids were sort of watching the behavior of their parents more, which I found quite interesting. So, several of the parents in the program talked about how they didn't think you could put the genie back in the bottle, that you couldn't ban the use of smartphones, or you couldn't restrict access in the way that some might like to, because of the behavior that parents are exhibiting through their phones. And I think that's very much the case in this household, where it's hard to police something that everyone has become so reliant on, this device in our pockets that can do so much. And there are interesting things like when they talked about what they were going to have for dinner, for example, the child's reaction was, well, how do I know what I want for dinner if I can't look at dinner options on social media? Whereas the parents who had the phone were sort of looking around for ideas. So I think that sort of disconnect, or that point of realization that we are just as addicted as our children, is a crucial point to remember, because I think, children are very, very good at calling out bullshit, aren't they? And if they are being told to do one thing, but seeing the example from us of doing something else, then they're going to call that out. So I think that was interesting.
Amazing. I'll definitely have to watch that. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I've definitely been known to go, you need to get off your phones whilst I'm checking my work email or looking at Instagram or LinkedIn on my phone. And yeah, the irony has definitely not escaped me. So yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, and I know you haven't seen it. So the other point that I think it goes into in quite some detail is the difference between boys and girls and the algorithms that social media uses to serve up content. And that's really worth watching. I think that's the bit that we should probably highlight within the show notes and urge people to go and look at, particularly if you have teenage boys or teenage girls, just to see the difference between what they are being shown and how, even if they tell the algorithms that they don't want to see content like aggressive content, extreme content where fighting, car crashes, these sorts of things are being served up to boys, as well as things like pornography, in a way that they just aren't to girls. I think it's a really, really important message. Even if you tell the social media that you don't want to see that content, it just fuels the algorithm to serve up more and more and more. So that difference, I think, is really, really interesting and was part of that documentary as well. So I really urge people to watch it. And I think the really crucial part of it all was the very end of the program, when the kids got their phones back and the sense of relief. One of the kids said, I feel like crying, because they'd suddenly got that connection back. And I think it's really, really crucial to understand how that relationship has grown over the years between the technology and your children. So I would urge everyone to watch it, because it really does shine a light on the challenge, I think. And now for our interview with Jim Sanders.
From his first day at RNIB in 2013, Jim was captivated by the realisation that designing for those with no or low vision creates a world that is better for everyone. He saw how blind and partially sighted people see differently and values the role that has in changing the world. He thinks that a world that works for blind and partially sighted people is better for all of us. With a versatile background in strategy and innovation spanning the private, public and third sectors, Jim has honed a skill set that is as diverse as it is deep. Today, as the leader of the innovation team at RNIB, he is running a series of experiments that are exploring alternative business models for charities and how we weave inclusivity and accessibility into the very fabric of societal structures, ensuring that impact and income coexist and thrive. Every experiment is a step towards a world where the visually impaired are not just participants, but are central to a universal narrative of inclusion. A testament to Jim's belief that a world crafted for the blind and partially sighted isn't just an act of empathy, but a journey towards a richer, more compassionate world for all. Jim, welcome to Starts at the Top.
Thank you, Zoe.
We're so happy to have you here. And goodness me, as I was reading that introduction, I was feeling incredibly inspired by not just what you're doing, but also the values that you're clearly really living in what you do and how you do it. So we're really excited to dig into both of those today as well. So shall we start just to set the scene by talking about where you and RNIB are currently at with digital?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to come and share as well. And it was strange hearing you read that stuff out, but I am passionate about it. It is me, for better or for worse. So where are we at with digital? RNIB is in a really interesting place and has been, I think, for many years, in which we have done some stuff which has been a bit groundbreaking, really kind of stretching it at one end. And at the other end, the sort of the tale of two organizations, we've got some stuff that's really kind of lagging behind and really challenging. So in all spaces, I think we find this in digital, but I feel like it's accentuated at RNIB more than other places which I've worked, in which there's some really inspiring stuff, and then there's some stuff where some of the basics are a lot more challenging. We've got older systems. So we experience, I think, digital stretch, where at one end we've got teams working in one way, thinking in one way, and at another end we've got teams working with a very different set of principles. So I think that's the big thing for me, actually, where we're at with digital, is how are we managing our stretch, the really interesting, exciting stuff that we've got to do that pulls the rest of the stuff forward, but also some of the basics around, old databases that need to be changed, that need to be updated. So we are working through trying to tackle those older bits, getting them up to date, making sure they're fit for purpose for the teams, without losing focus on the stretch stuff, because that's the inspirational stuff. That's the game-changing stuff. And I think as well, we're really acutely aware that for blind and partially sighted people, digital can be the answer. It can be the solution to so many problems. And that's if you build your solutions, if you build your technology from the ground up, thinking about those different needs, the needs of someone who's got no or low vision. All too often, however, people don't think about those needs. And as a result of that, we find that digital can be actually the exclusion and actually make a more exclusory world, which stops blind and partially sighted people. So it makes the situation worse. So it's really interesting, again, when I move on to the kind of the external view, digital for for a lot of our customers is both the kind of the poison and the cure. If we get it right, it can be really transformational. Too often, society at large, we get it wrong, and it ends up excluding blind and partially sighted people. So, as well as that internal focus on how we grow, we've also got an external focus on how we kind of push, stimulate, create solutions in that space that work for blind and partially sighted people, and encourage other people to create those solutions ourselves. So we're at an interesting moment as well we can't have this conversation without talking about AI, but we're at an interesting moment at the moment with the explosion of generative AI tools and their application to support people, their application as tools. And we're really getting into that. And I'm super excited about some of the things which we're looking at about how we can get these tools to create a world that works for blind and partially sighted people.
Oh, well, that's super exciting. Obviously, that's the topic of the moment, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit more about what you're doing in AI and what you've learned so far?
Yeah, sure. So we've got there've been some interesting things, some basics which I think will probably affect a lot of people. So we're a Microsoft shop, and we are preparing ourselves for the rollout of Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, and I've got a license myself. A number of members of the team have, but we haven't rolled it out across the organization. So one of the things that just basic productivity tools. My team have been using, my innovation team have been using ChatGPT, and we got ChatGPT 4 licenses as soon as that was available as soon as that came out, and we've integrated that into our working practice and how we do things, and found it really, these types of productivity tools, really, really powerful in doing stuff like some of our ideation processes, some of our strategy thinking. Having a tool that is a really good kind of sounding board that you can bounce ideas off is really valuable. So we've been using some of those productivity tools. What we've also been doing is we've been getting some AI models to effectively ingest all of our internal knowledge, including our policies, systems information, to be able to serve that up to staff as part of the work which we're doing in Copilot. So that's been really good. Again, internally focusing support. And then we're working at the moment on a live chat model. So effectively using generative AI to be able to have a very human, empathic conversation to be able to provide people information, advice, and guidance about sight loss. At the moment, we have a service, Zoe, which is our sight loss advice service, which is effectively a phone service in which anybody can call us up and ask us any question about sight loss, whether you're blind or partially sighted or worried about it, or a friend or family or a professional. It doesn't matter who you are, you can call us up. And we want to be able to provide a live chat option because we can't provide that telephone line 24/7. So when we're not able to answer your phone call, you can go, or maybe some people would prefer just engaging with chatbots. There's another generation of people coming through who would rather use a chatbot than call someone up. So again, it's providing that, working to that wide range of needs that we have. So that's really exciting because, and I'll dig into this in a little bit more detail. What we've done there is we have got our entire knowledge base, and we have basically thrown it into a generative AI model, and we have got our teams on the telephone to start to train it. So they'll receive a call, they'll type in what the call's about, and then the model will start to suggest things that they could talk to the customer about. They'll start to serve up that content, and our teams have then been using that to support the calls. They've already got really great knowledge, so they can also say, actually, this was relevant and this wasn't relevant. So they can start to train it. We can start to see what type of answers it produces, because obviously we want to manage the risk of any wrong answers being provided there. So it's been helping those frontline teams provide better services to blind and partially sighted people, friends, family, anybody who's interested in understanding more about sight loss. And it's also enabled us to train that system so that when we go live with that chat model, we will be able to have confidence that it is going to support people really well, and that people will be confident and feel like they can trust this source. So that's another thing we've been doing. And then I think the other thing which is probably worth noting is we do a lot of transcription services for utility companies and banks and that type of organization. So if you are blind or partially sighted, you often need to view your bill in a different format. Now, like most of us, it either kind of comes through the post, bit of paper which we have to read, or we've got the app or the email and we access it like that. And often that information isn't presented in a way that somebody with no or low vision can access it, which means they're being denied of that, that fundamental right. I need to know how much my, electricity bill is. I need to be able to manage it. So we provide these services that enable us to effectively transcribe that information into an accessible format. And to date, the way that has worked, not to get too technical, but we effectively take word for word the text and we do a transformation that turns it into either an audio file or a large text file. But you get your bill in that way. Now, if you imagine what that must be like for some people, you get your electricity bill and it starts off by reading the name of the company, reading your address, well, you know your address, reading the date, dear Zoe, blah, 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 blah. And eventually you get down and you get the bit that you're looking for. Now, when I'm doing that, I skip all of that. I don't read any of that. I just like, what's the damage? That's what I'm looking for at the end. So we've been experimenting with some tools to be able to have a much more human view of it. So we can do bills which are, Zoe, this is your electricity bill. This month you have spent £150 on your electricity. That's £10 more than this time last year, but that amount is accounted for by the increase in rates. You're using about the same amount of electricity. Now, that is a whole set of real interesting insight that's really useful to anybody managing their bills. That actually, the reason why we're excited about it is ultimately it provides a better service than just your electricity bill these days, because there's insight added in, there's adjustments, and with the data which we've got, we should be able to do that. So we've started to experiment with doing that and being able to provide bills in that type of form. And I think that's quite interesting, because then you get into a place where, you're providing a service that is perhaps better than the service that most sighted people get, and enables you to manage your situation better.
Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? Because that's where the service really starts to add that additional value, isn't it? It moves from a place of being just passively communicating and actually saying, have you also thought about this? And this is how it compares to the previous information you've had, which is great.
Exactly, and I think that is where we are excited about some of the things which we can do. And I think reaching people with that information. I mean, if you look at the determinants for health, the outcomes for blind and partially sighted people, on almost all measures, they are worse off than the general population of the UK. So anything which we can do to try and make life easier, make life better, the better. So yeah, we're very excited by it, and I think experimenting around with, what is the right information, how's that helpful, is really useful. Ultimately, right, it's a product that probably everybody would like. I don't, like getting the paper or reading all of the, chaff in my bill. I want the insight, right? Not just the information. I want the insight. And that's what's interesting, I think, about where we're going. It's like, how can we provide insight to contextualize information that you're getting?
How much do you feel that the RNIB is then in a perpetual state of beta? Because a lot of this has to be tested, I guess, before it goes in front of people. And I know, having read around some of your projects in the past, you have a really active community of people who do help you with these projects. So you could just tell us a bit more about how that works.
Yeah, so I would say we are in a perpetual state of beta, Paul. Absolutely, I'd really agree with that. And in fact, the way in which we do transformation and change at large actually has quite a kind of proof of concept prototyping approach to it. And let me explain this in a bit more detail. So I'm going to go back to an example about accessible televisions. So going back, 15 years or so, televisions weren't accessible. And the thing a lot of people don't know is that for a lot of blind and partially sighted people, TV is a massive support for them, right? They watch and listen to it and find it very entertaining. And it's an important part of their lives. So not being able to get access to the TV, not being able to control it is important for a lot of people. So we looked at how can you create an accessible television? And we went to the market, and the market was like, it's not doable. You can't create accessible TVs. So we said, okay, we're going to, with some brown sticky tape, some string, a rubber band, create a very terrible version of what an accessible TV looks like. And by hook or by crook, we managed to cobble something together. That was bad, but it was an accessible TV. We showed it to the industry, and the industry was like, oh, we can do much better than that. So what we've done there is create that initial proof of concept, right? That kind of the beta. And we've actually gone, we are not the people to scale accessible TVs, right? That's not us. We're not the people to take these things to market writ large. And particularly because whilst sometimes we have to provide bespoke products for blind and partially sighted people through our shop and through other means, we believe that mainstream products should be accessible for everybody. So what we're looking to do is trying to create change in the way in which markets generate products and services that mean that it's not a case of special products for special people, but the product that your friend will buy is the product that's relevant to you. And we find this problem, writ large across it. So what we've done often, Paul, is take these examples and create something that is not fantastic, but shows that it can be done. And to do that, we use a large team of blind and partially sighted people who do a whole load of accessibility and usability testing. And we've developed a real expertise and a real large team that can provide incredibly high quality advice, such that we've got consultancy services which we now sell to large organizations. And for a quick example, we helped Bank of England create the accessible banknotes that we now have. We've helped create accessible ATMs. The list goes on, all from the perspective, how can we make a better product that works for blind and partially sighted people? And almost always you end up, when you do that, creating a better product for everybody. So there's an interesting thing about how, when we think about sight loss and you think about somebody with sight loss, that actually for the mainstream population who are lucky enough to have sight, fixing that problem for someone with sight loss actually makes a better product for everybody. A great example of this that lots of people talk about is the iPhone. If a sighted person comes to an iPhone, there are moments where they are functionally temporarily blind. Maybe that's not quite the right phrase for it, but if you're, for example, driving a car, you can't look at your phone, but because it is voice accessible, you can talk to it and you can do almost everything you would do anyway. So it's those overlaps in which creating a product for blind and partially sighted people is the right thing to do, because it means that they're included in the world, but also creates better products for everybody, which is more value for you. So we sell those consultancy services, and blind and partially sighted people are crucial to the value and quality of work which we end up doing there. And so often that is in the digital space. These solutions I'm talking about are almost always digital or at least technological solutions which have got digital elements. And we couldn't do that without our really wide network of people who've got lived experience in sight loss.
I think it comes down to that quite often, doesn't it? That regardless of what the piece of technology is, sometimes it's created in isolation. There's an organisation, a company who's got something that they think they're really excited about, and they create it in a dark room and they unleash it onto the world, and everyone says, well, that's fine, but it doesn't work for me. And I think looking at communities such as blind and partially sighted people, other communities, hearing loss, all of those sorts of things, and just designing products that actually work for human beings, the vast array of human beings. But you're absolutely right. Some of the accessibility features that are included on our television are in use in this house, and none of us have a registered disability, but we do use some of those features, and specifically on the phone, some of the magnification things and other bits and pieces that we wouldn't have been able to use in the past if those products hadn't been influenced by the audience, an audience that they're created for, but not necessarily designed around.
No, absolutely.
And this feels like a good moment to ask you about some of those business models, because I remember that was something I was very intrigued by when we met at that conference a few months ago, and I thought I must get Jim on and ask him about this. So you talked about where income and impact can coexist, and some of the things you've learned, the products you've developed, and who you're working with, the consultancy services. Could you begin perhaps by telling people about what that model looks like, and then also where you're thinking it could go?
Yeah, so with our consultancy services, it's a commercial consultancy service model. We have got deep insight into the lived experience of sight loss, and we work with a lot of big players and have relationships with them, providing insight into their products and services, and explaining how you can improve them to make them work for everybody. So we often think, and just picking up on what Paul was saying, we often don't think actually in terms of accessibility, but more actually usability sometimes. That really it is about using it, isn't it? And how does someone use it? And a great example of this is you can make a website technically accessible and it be functionally unusable, or a system. So if you have to, if you've got a CRM system, just to get down to brass tacks, because we all have them, and a member of your staff's got sight loss and they have to tab through 52 columns to get to the field they want, it's technically accessible, but it's functionally unusable. So I think there's an important thing there. So we look to provide it's an inclusive design consultancy that we provide there, which is effectively insight into the lived experience of sight loss, and we will help provide advice, testing, co-design experiences to develop better products. So that's one model, Zoe, which is our inclusive design consultancy. My team also, we're actually looking for new business models. So, for example, one of the challenges that blind and partially sighted people face is travel. It's really challenging, and it means that a lot of people stay at home and don't go out and stay social and miss miss medical appointments and can't always make it to the shop. Really challenging. Travel is such a key enabler in our lives. So there are lots of good tools that will get you a lot of the way. So, for example, Google Maps will get you roughly to the building, but it won't get you to the front door often, and it won't show you where the front door is. So you can get to a building and not know where the front door is because you can't see it. So what we often talk about is the problem of the last 5 meters with travel. So we've spent some time looking at how we can develop a solution that works for blind and partially sighted people that enables them to have advice and guidance on that final bit of the journey from a local travel hub, not just to the venue but through the door. And so at the moment we're experimenting with that. We ran a pilot in Brighton. We're running another one we're kicking off shortly in Nottingham to look at how we can provide a tool which is free to blind and partially sighted people, which is a pre-planning tool that enables you to go from a travel hub to your destination, and look at how it will help businesses be more accessible, and so how we can get some financial value from that from businesses, their willingness to pay. So we're experimenting and kind of learning, like how would this model, how could this model work? And obviously in the process, we are capturing lots of data about the types of information which you need if you've got no or low levels of vision to go from a transport hub to a venue. So that's one example of a business model delivering impact to blind and partially sighted people, having a revenue stream driven by a digital solution. Now, that may or may not work. First pilot was really good, really promising. I'm really excited and hopeful for it. But you know what? If the Nottingham pilot tells us that this actually, it's not relevant for whatever set of reasons, we're going to know before we've rolled it out. And I think that thing for me, that kind of focus on learning and just really obsessing about what's this insight telling us? How are we testing this and getting really sure that this is the right thing for us? That's the thing which we're really trying to focus on. Because even if this business model, even if this idea doesn't work, we'll have learned a whole load of stuff which will help us with the next one, which we're trialing. So we've got a function, which is my team, which are effectively looking at what are some of the new business models. How do we then design experiments to work out if these things are goers or not? And that is exciting stuff, because I think, as there is an increasing pressure, certainly on charities, or there's an increasing fundraising pressure, the way in which people are donating money is changing. We need to look at how our business models are resilient to that, so that we can continue to do the really vital and crucial work which we do for a lot of blind and partially sighted people.
So I think that's so incredibly exciting on 2 fronts. So firstly, the product you described, and I love that way of framing it as the last 5 meters. I can see how that would be useful for users with other kinds of disability as well. So where there's massive potential there. And that takes me on to the second point, because it's really interesting to hear more about your inclusive design consultancy. Do you think that within the sector, where we've got charities like yours, where you have a huge amount of expertise and subject matter as well as digital experts, do we need to be thinking in a more ambitious way about this, in the way that you and your team clearly are? Is it beyond the realms of possibility that a charity could get to a point where they have a an inclusive design and build agency within their walls, as much as doing the sort of service delivery, providing the information advice that obviously they need to under their charitable objects. Do we need to be thinking bigger about this stuff, is what I'm saying?
I think so, 100%, Zoe. I think over the past sort of 4 or 5 years at RNIB, we've been trying to really challenge ourselves about what our strategic direction should be, and what is kind of mission complete, go home. What are all the things that need to change for to create a world that works for everybody. And for us specifically, that's for blind and partially sighted people. But really, I think you have to consider the question in the round. And so we've tried to really build that into our strategic approach. So what we've done is we've looked at what are all of the needs that blind and partially sighted people have, and where are there things or barriers that are stopping somebody fully engaging with society. So, for example, travel. The bus is not accessible. I can't get to, which means I can't get to work, which means I can't have a job, which means, or, I need a Braille book, and the latest, the latest book that's come out that my book group's reading isn't in Braille, so I can't join in and be part of that. So we've looked at all of these kind of problems, and we've built our strategy around how do we fix change, and whether that's do it ourselves or stimulate, push the market, show the art of the possible with some speculative design, some scamps, some crude prototypes of this is what it could look like, or whether it's we'll deliver a service whilst there is a gap here and campaign for that gap to be filled by private sector or public sector or what have you. So we've tried to look at what that is, but even looking at it on the scale we are, I think needs to be expanded a bit further. So it's not just what's mission complete for you as a charity, but if we're going to, as a sector, have a credible voice and face into private sector organizations, public sector organizations, we need to be starting to think about, when we are suggesting solutions, how have we thought about all of the problems, all of the challenges which someone who is designing that solution needs to look to? Too often, if I'm a private sector organization, RNIB may tell me your product needs to be like X, and maybe RNID, Royal National Institute for the Deaf, may say your product needs to be like Y, and so they'll have all of these kind of competing opinions, and they'll be left there. It's like, well, how do I square this circle? How do I work out what actually works for someone who's got sight loss, works for someone who's got hearing loss, works for someone who's maybe in a wheelchair, whatever it is. So I think there's a space, and we need to start thinking more about how we we as a sector take leadership and coordinate. What are the principles by which you need to create solutions that work for everybody? Because if we are successful, we've still only solved the problem for blind and partially sighted people. And there is a wider community there that needs their needs met. So I absolutely think that more people should be thinking about this. We should think about what are all the barriers and what genuinely solves all of these problems, and how can we coordinate on having a singular and clear voice that looks to present options to public and private sector that is a sort of, a definitive guide to how I do this well, if you will, and create an inclusive society. Because I think that voice really needs to come from the charity sector, because I think that's where the lived experience expertise comes from. And that's the authenticity and the value that everybody needs to hear, and everybody needs to sit up and listen to, and everybody needs to understand that anybody, if there's anybody who's excluded from society, we are all the poorer for it. And making sure society is fully inclusive makes society better for everybody. And that's what I think we need to really kind of live that ideals by.
I love this, and I'm excited by it, because I think one of my perhaps frustrations with the sector sometimes is that everyone talks about silos in organisations, but quite often we see silos developing, don't we, around some very specific causes. And of course, your organisation is going to get set up in some ways to deal with some specific issues. But as you say, Jim, there's that challenge around, well, people sometimes have more than one problem. And actually, we need a much better effort on collaboration in order to solve those multiple problems, but also to look at where we've got transferable expertise and products and services that can help people who've got different problems. So I think that's a really good point that you've made there. And what's stopping that happening currently, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the challenges are around the way we think about creating solutions and we think about our roles. So I come across a lot organizations that are very keen for their voice to be heard, and it often results in a series of problems that the people that organization represents experience. It doesn't start to stray into, okay, so what are some of the solutions that could potentially help, and how can we test this and be part of a creation of solutions? So I think there's a piece there about how we can be more solution focused and how we can mature. So I love the movement of, the authentic voice, of the lived experience voice. I think that's a great move. I think the next part of it, and with a kind of design type background, the next part of that is, it's co-design, right? It's people who are experiencing, who have lived experience of sight loss, being part of the design process, being part of the creation process, being part of that ultimate value chain, which creates a new thing in society. And I think that needs to evolve beyond just the voice to actually active participation in the design process. And I think that's a skill set as well, which we need to, as a sector, start to look for, hunt for more. There are some great examples where it exists, but we need more of it, I think.
So you've corralled that for your particular sector, for blind and partially sighted people, and obviously there are other organisations out there that are doing the same. So does the onus then have to switch to the providers? So the big tech firms that are shaping our future, like it or not, the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, should be beating a path to your door, and therefore, to the sector as a whole, to say, right, it's not enough for us to have a room of 20 people around a table telling us whether this product is good or not. What we actually need is day one conversation with an entire group of people from all different walks of life to make sure that we are doing our level best to, as you said, design for everyone. And we're never going to get 100% of those people. But surely that's something that the sector should be looking at, is how do you build a viable partner organization to these big tech organizations that does its level best to provide what you're providing for blind and partially sighted people, a group of advocates and people that are ready, willing and skilled in the advice that they give.
Absolutely, Paul, and that's what we've done with our inclusive design consultancy. It's there, it's available. If you want advice on how to make better products that work for blind and partially sighted people, and in the process better products overall, it's there. And the more other organisations across the sector can start thinking in those terms and start creating that capability, the better. 100%.
And what you described earlier, that thing about looking further beyond the particular cause, thinking about what's the wider impact that I can create by working in partnership with other organisations, that needs a new approach to leadership, doesn't it?
I think so, absolutely, and I don't. I'm not sure I've got many answers for you on this one, Zoe. But yes, it does require a different approach to leadership. It requires a different approach to the way in which we are thinking about and doing charity, I think, because at the moment, we're seeing. It's interesting. We're seeing large charities, a load of large charities delivering often kind of statutory services or really crucial services that you could argue, should the state be providing these? Should the NHS be providing these? And struggling with really wide, complex remits which causes, at the top of our conversation, we were talking about, the stretch challenge with digital infrastructure and being behind in one area and trying to stretch ahead. The complexity of those organizations, the digital problems that we experience are a reflection of the complexity of the organizations, the complexity of the remit. And that's being kind of challenged by really hyper-focused causes, right? Real single issue social enterprises that are popping up really, really quickly, that are having an impact, that are using new digital tools to go far and wide quickly. And we need to kind of balance that, because the thing I worry about is a lot of it ends up becoming kind of flavor of the month. And a lot of energy gets put into, yes, we want this thing to be the flavor of the month. And then we kind of move on, and how much of this stuff beds in, how much of it sticks, how much of it creates lasting change, and how much of it is just a headline or clickbait. And so I think we need to think about, how as a sector we are coordinating and having a clearer voice across the board as to how society needs to change to support people who are currently excluded in one way or another.
This is about power as much as technology, isn't it? And our relationship with those communities.
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to people and focus, right? For leaders. They're the things which we can't do anything without people. We're still fundamentally a human economy. How do we support, nurture, grow people? And then how do we have relentless laser focus on achieving what it is that we're trying to achieve? And sometimes that's about understanding the broader system, the broader problem, and where we can kind of fit into it, and where we're going to be most effective.
So that's so interesting, isn't it? Because maybe it means then we have to take a more ambitious approach to systems change, because it's the systems we're trying to change in society, but we also need to change our own organizations and what leadership looks like and what organizational structures look like, and also how we prepare those people for leadership when their remit needs to be broader and more impactful, rather than here's a cause, here's a thing, I need to look after this territory and this particular way of doing things.
Yeah, and partnership and collaboration becomes the lifeblood of the sector at that point, doesn't it? It's not going to achieve half of the things it can if it doesn't do that. And there's loads of great examples where, when we're trying to do system change, we need to get people who have got lived experience, who want that change. We need people who've got the power in the system. And if we take, for example, transport, that's the rail providers, right? It's public transport providers, it's government funding. We need to get those people round the table. We need to then, share a collective vision of where we want to go. And then really, it's about that group of people working out what that looks like, and not being stymied by good being shouted down by the perfect. Actually, what's the next thing that makes this better? So having a real practical focus, because pace, I think, has a big thing a big role to play in these changes, right? Seeing change happen, begets more change. So it's how do we convene those groups of people, and that necessarily has to be cross-sector, though, and not just intra-sector, but it has to be across public and private sector as well. How do we convene those groups of people who've all got expertise in a different area to make this change and make that change fundamentally stick?
And I think that's the trick, isn't it, Zoe? That's what we've been talking about. The reason for this podcast was to say, look, there's learning over here. Don't let this learning sit within one particular silo. It needs to be shared across the sectors. And I'm surprised still that conversation is still so right, despite the fact that we've been talking about it for so many years. It's where that leadership does really need to look beyond its borders and say, right, how do we take this bigger? What do we need to do to, in your words, collaborate and partner up with organisations to present that united whole, but then really reaching across to the private sector, which is driving a lot of this technology change and a lot of the stuff that's influencing us as a society, and say, look, we're here. Don't just tap us on the shoulder and ask us an opinion when you've got a new product to share. Bring us in at the very, very ground.
Absolutely.
And how do you think we can best sell that concept in to the private sector and obviously the public sector as well? Because your story, which you've told so brilliantly this morning, Jim, there's such a lot of expertise in terms of lived experience, but also digital within your organisation. How can we make other sectors more aware of all the things that our sector has to offer, do you think?
In a lot of instances with the private sector, it's starting to happen. And what we need to do is we need to jump on the opportunities where organizations, and we've had this where organizations have come to us and they've said, we want to we think this is a problem for blind and partially sighted people and we want to solve it. And we spend some time working with them to help them kind of just get underneath the skin of that, right? Work out, okay, this is kind of the presenting problem, but actually the kind of the core problem exists further down. The real thing you need to solve is X, Y, or Z. So we've had some of that initial outreach. We've had that kind of where people have just approached us cold, saying we want to solve this problem. And I think partly that's because a lot of private sector organisations are starting to understand more their image and understand the important leadership role that they need to play in society. If you provide the products or services that most citizens consume, you are an important part of the fabric of society, and you need to act your role. So I think that there's sort of the early signs of that. So that needs to be fed with the consumer behavior as well. Buying into brands that are more ethical, that have got more of an interest in creating a world that works for everybody. So I think there is already the seeds, the early adopters who get from a brand perspective, but also from an ethical, like, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. And I've heard that from a number of corporates. So we need to kind of play into that and build momentum there. And that's so that those types of product improvements and enhancements, they go from being a market differentiator to permission to play. And that's, I think, the key switch which we need to get in a lot of the public sector and a lot of the markets out there. We need to get these basic accessibility, usability features move into the space of, you can't enter this market if your product doesn't do this, rather than if your product does this, it's better than the other things in the market. So that's part of the switch which I think we need in the public sector. And a lot of that is kind of influencing, and it's using all of the tools at our disposal. Great insight into the lived experience of sight loss. Us then using that with our design expertise, being able to help people design better products, but also not being afraid to say, well, actually, there's legislation here which says you have to do this, so we can help you do it. And being confident to celebrate the times when they do it and shout about that, but also being confident to challenge when they're not. But with all of those challenges, being solution focused, and this is how we could do it. We can work with you. So I think that's that tackles the private sector stuff and one aspect of what we need to do there. And I think with the public sector, again, a lot of the campaigning, which a lot of great organisations across the charity sector do, is really crucial. A recent example of this is there was going to be a ticket office closure on the railway ticket offices, which would have meant that a lot of people, including blind and partially sighted people, as well as elderly people, as well as a large cohort of people, would have restricted their ability to travel. And RNIB and a variety of other organisations actually got together, made the voices of blind and partially sighted people, of old people, really clearly heard, and we managed to get a turnaround in that process. The next step is, okay, how do we create solutions, better, newer solutions that do work, that do leverage technology, work for everybody? So I think there's the kind of the next step on there, where not only are we making sure the needs of blind and partially sighted people are really clearly heard by government policymakers, but also how we then look to create solutions. And that just means, I think it's more engagement work there. It's showing the art of the possible. It's also on us to understand the complexity of the way some government purchasing works. So we often come across money which has been allocated to redo a inner city centre that got allocated 10 years ago that has a design, and we're like, we know this isn't going to work for blind and partially sighted people. Can you please change it in this way? And that's quite challenging when that money, there's such a time lag between the allocation of those funds when it actually gets spent and your ability to therefore kind of shape and change it before those solutions have been created. But I think it's about keeping on doing that and keeping on putting pressure at that system level, right? Because often it's the points or the problems that we end up focusing on, which are often symptoms of a deeper cause. So there are challenges, I think, around the way in which funding works, the way in which legislation works, which at some point, as a society at whole, not just the charity sector, but as a society as a whole, we're going to need to grapple with and look to tackle.
Just to finish on a positive note, I'm a big gamer, and that community, I think, is a real sign of where things are headed, in that the gaming community does not let the big players get away with putting out a game, especially these big AAA rated games that are just, huge investments. They don't let them get away with putting out a game now that doesn't have those accessibility features. And I've seen video game companies take an almighty hit when the community comes to life and says, this isn't good enough, this isn't what we expect, and you've had months and months and months to build this game and it's come out in this state. That seems to be an area where that community is standing up, being heard, and having an immediate effect on what those companies are doing.
Yeah, it's a great example, Paul. Absolutely, and we've done a load of work in that gaming space, and it's great that we've got an example of where a community is really being heard there, and we need to think about how that applies to other areas and what we can learn from that. But I think it's a great example. Totally agree with you.
Yeah, it's an example of accountability really being exercised by a community rather than an organisation, isn't it? So I think that speaks to your point about how things need to look very different. Jim, this has been amazing. Thank you. Really inspiring. I'm loving your yes and approach to leadership and impact. And it's got my brain whirring about all the things we need to do differently across all three sectors. The story you've told this morning is so compelling. And because we know we've got leaders from the public, the private, as well as the third sector listening, how can anyone who might want to collaborate with RNIB get in touch with you?
You can email me, jim.sanders@rnib.org.uk. Get in touch. Very, very keen for anybody who reaches out to build some connections.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Zoe and Paul.
Thank you so much once again to Jim for coming onto the podcast and sharing his insight with us. Some really interesting work being done at the RNIB, and I'd really urge people to go and check out some of that on their website. One of the things that I really love about what they're doing is the work they're doing around alt tags and imagery, and there's a link that we can share that goes directly to that campaign, so you can see the importance of alt tagging to images that you're using on the internet.
Huge thanks to Jim. Fascinating conversation.
As always, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way through to the end of the episode. Thank you very much. And you can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us to reach more people. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, do share us with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.
Bye for now.